I'm Sally Blair, Senior Director for Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. Happy Valentine's Day, by the way. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Digital Migration and the Democratization of Africa's Information Space, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow George Sarpong. We are delighted to have with us as discussant Nicholas Benequista, Research Manager and Editor at the Center for International Media Assistance, CIMA. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now in our 18th year, the program has hosted more than 290 fellows from over 90 countries. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to media freedom and democracy in Ghana. As numerous sub-Saharan African countries make the switch from analog to digital broadcasting, regulators, governments, and policymakers have largely failed to consider how the digital migration process will impact censorship, media ownership, and access to information, and there is already cause for concern. The majority of African countries have designed digital migration policies that establish governmental monopolies of broadcast signal distribution platforms. Unanswered questions surrounding the legal status and regulatory relationship between content producers and broadcast signal distribution platforms could drive greater censorship and fewer constitutional protections for broadcasters. It is critical to understand how this transition will affect the integrity of the African media space and to design interventions to mitigate the democratic degradation that could result from it. In his presentation, Mr. George Sarpong will examine approaches to digital migration across the continent, explain legal and regulatory fault lines, and explore how migration strategies could undermine democratic principles if governments, civil society, and the international community fail to address fundamental policy questions. Comments by Nick Benequista will follow. George Sarpong is a lawyer, journalist, and recognized industry leader in media and communications policy in Ghana. He is currently the Executive Secretary of Ghana's National Media Commission, which oversees more than 360 radio stations, 80 registered newspapers, 25 television channels, and various online publications. As Executive Secretary, he initiates and implements policies to ensure free, responsible, pluralistic, and diverse media and works to address threats to media freedom and development. George also spearheads several civil society initiatives. He is the founder and chair of the board of the Media and Governance Institute, and in 2001, he founded the Youth Network for Human Rights and Democracy, UNET, to train young Ghanaians in leadership and good governance. Additionally, in 2010, he set up the Party Youth Forum to foster peaceful cooperation among youth from different political parties. Nick Benequista is the research manager and editor at CIMA, a think tank unit at NED dedicated to strengthening efforts around the world to build vibrant and pluralistic media systems that can sustain democratic politics. He was previously a foreign correspondent based in Ethiopia and has done extensive research in Africa on media, citizenship, and accountability. We will now turn the floor over to George, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Nick for about 10 minutes. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NE Democracy. If you have not already done so, please join me in taking a moment to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved with this event, and most especially Research Associate Emily Myers, who has offered vital assistance to the Fellowship Project and today's presentation. George.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you, and I'm sure as all of us walk into this hall, one of the things that welcome you to NED and into this hall is a sign that proclaims an immortal truth for me that says, democracy involves the right of the people to freely determine their own destiny. The exercise of this right requires a system that guarantees freedom of expression, belief and association, free and competitive elections, respect for the inalienable rights of individuals and minorities, free communications media, and the rule of law. This speaks so strongly to my personal convictions, and I believe to you as well. And I think that is what unites us this afternoon in this conversation. And that is why I'm particularly grateful for the privilege of your time. I want to thank Carl and your colleagues on the board and the leadership of this institution, Chris, all of you, first for the opportunity to be here, and secondly also for the personal interest you've shown in me and the modest work I'm doing. Let me also thank all of you, staff at the forum, CIMA, program staff, especially the Africa team, the CIMA team, Nick and your people. Let me borrow from my friend Vera to say the party is not over yet between us as we engage media issues on the continent. For the fellowship team, Sally, Sexes, Megan, Hannah, Melissa, who jokes she's not sure where she belongs, whether at fellowships or forum, Andrea, our research associates, and Emily, I don't know what I could have done without you. For me, you represent all that is admirable about this institution. Brain power, commitment to work, support, self-confidence, critical thinking. And I wish you well in everything you do. I thank you most sincerely. I think that as we reflect on the big questions that confront us with democracy around the world, one of the things that all of us perhaps would agree on is the central role that media and free communication play in that process. In the particular case of Africa, I think we've all taken note of the advancement that we have seen in democratic development. But at the same time, we have seen considerable backsliding on the continent. Whichever way you look at it, whether in terms of advancing democracy or arresting the backsliding, it appears that the media have a critical role to play. And that is why issues involving the future information space and what can unravel should matter to all of us. And that is why, once again, I'm very grateful that all of you show interest in what we are talking about. The structure of the presentation is in 3 simple parts. First is to try to illustrate, not too much technology, but just a basic diagrammatic representation of what we are talking about with data migration. Then we will try to explain the concerns that we see in terms of the implications for policy, governance, and free expression. And then attempt some ideas about what we think can be done to address them. First, why are we undertaking this migration process? It is mainly because it offers great advantages. If you conceived of broadcasting and everything that we do in our lives today, every remote communication that you see, including what I'm holding and how it's able to control the processes here, it's using frequency spectrum, even though this is a particular type of frequency that is not regulated. So if you use your car remote control to open your car, you are dealing with frequencies. If you take your remote control to control your television, you are dealing with frequency. As we expand with technology, the spectrum becomes the most important thing that is needed. Now, in analog broadcasting, if you conceive of the spectrum like an imaginary path in space, if you were broadcasting one television channel in analog mode, you may need like 6 to 8 megahertz of spectrum for that one channel. In digital mode, you can use the same 6 megahertz spectrum to transmit between 20 to 80 channels, depending on whether you are transmitting in standard definition or high definition. So there's major advantage in going digital. And precisely because of that advantage, it gives you an opportunity to create plural and diverse media. Because then if you have 10 megahertz of spectrum, you can create so many channels. And for places like Africa where we have diverse communities, different ethnic groups, different languages, then it gives you an opportunity to serve almost every community. Plus, the opportunity also to reflect all diverse political viewpoints. So there are major advantages in the migration process. And again, for viewers, the thing that is most outstanding to us is that digital TV gives you better viewing experience, quality sound, quality vision. So there are major reasons why the world is transmitting. Let me just quickly explain in quick session. In analog broadcasting, if you took the camera here to represent the content producer, you have one content producer who produces content and sends to a transmission system, which then beams to your homes. So those who remember the old TVs, whether you are using the rabbit ear or the Yagi antenna, then your antenna picked it for, okay, that's the rabbit ear. Okay, so in simple illustration, this was a TV in analog mode. So it was one entity that did all this. In digital mode, this is how TV is done. Conceive of all these as different television stations. Because you can compress into a small bandwidth, you can send all these into a signal distributing platform where some complex processes happen, including modulation and compression, which enables you to compress the material into smaller bits. So if you thought of it like the way you send email, you zip email, big files to send, it's essentially the same kind of thing, which enables you to send huge content, which then gets distributed to homes and the different systems. So this, in simple terms, is how it will look like, even though in real terms, what we are describing here are a huge set of infrastructure. So straight away, this leads you into some kind of reflections. What does this mean for policy and for free expression? The first thing you recognize is that that central point that we just showed as a signal distributor then becomes one single point of control, particularly in countries where, like Africa, where almost all of us are constructing one platform for this signal distribution. partly because the cost of constructing the platform is beyond what any TV station can do. Secondly, also because governments need to farm the spectrum that is available. So if, say, you had 10 TV stations, each one of them using 6 megahertz of spectrum, that is 60 megahertz. If you compress all 10 into one stream, then you give them 6 megahertz, and you have 56 megahertz available for data transmission, for electronic health, for e-education, for e-services in agriculture, and many other fields. Plus, the band in which television operates in analog mode, which is the 700 and 800 megahertz, that is the prime spot for wireless communication. If you were doing, let's say, telephony, mobile phone service, the same base station or one antenna would serve twice the same population in the 700 as it would do in the 1900. So it is cheaper to do data in the 700, and that's why, again, we need to move the people. So governments can't allow broadcasters to stay on the spectrum. So this is why in Africa, almost all the countries have decided, the governments have decided that they will create one platform through which everybody is transmitting. Our fear is that that then creates a simple point of control from where broadcasting can be controlled and manipulated. And I'll tell you a quick story about Kenya. In the last elections in Kenya, the opposition had disputed the elections, and Raila Odinga has said he would swear himself in because he thought he had won the elections. So they were organizing a press conference to put out their case and also to do this symbolic swearing in. On the day of that swearing in, the signal distribution platform went off. The luck was that Kenya was in that process of migrating to digital, we call it simulcast, where you are transmitting both in analog mode and in digital mode. So people switched onto the analog to see what was going on. Otherwise, television, the media would have been closed. In a certain sense, it also reminds me of a small story in Liberia where under Charles Taylor, there was only one person who sold newsprint, who was a friend to Charles Taylor. So if your material was ready to be printed, and the printer looked at it and it was critical to Taylor, all of a sudden there was no newsprint. In other words, anytime any single entity controls communications resources, there is danger to free expression. And we see that in this. The next thing is that we think is of concern is that in almost all our countries, the governments have set this one up as monopolies that the government owns in partnership with essentially one Chinese company called StarTimes. We have counted so far about 21 countries where this Chinese company is operating. Even those areas where you have Signet and Eutelsat, we are not too sure how far they would survive because in Ghana, the contract was given to some company that built the platform almost to 90% complete. Eventually, it was taken over by the Chinese. These countries that we have not indicated, it is because we don't have the data on who is controlling the signal distributing platform. It is possible that some of them could still be close to this Chinese company called StarTimes. We think this by itself has implications for free expression on the continent, but we will not dwell on that for now. The next issue that we want to raise is about definition issues and questions of liability and protection. We had indicated to you that in analog mode, one entity does the content and the transmission, so that's the TV station. And then explain that in digital mode, we unbundle the value chain between content producers and signal distributors. So precisely who is the broadcaster? And that's not academic. There's a legal conundrum there that needs to be examined. First, who bears liability where there is offensive content? Is it the signal distributor or the content producer? The lawyers here would notice that at tort, the principle is that anybody who contributes to wrongdoing bears liability to the extent of their contribution. And this has particularly been complicated for the media industry throughout history. The invention of the printing press brought the question about whether or not printers and publishers should be held liable for the writings of people who published material that kings in Europe thought were offensive, particularly those that criticized the king or war efforts and things like that. As late as the 1960s in England, when D.H. Lawrence wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, it was the Penguin books that were prosecuted. It is the same principle that again showed itself when telephone and telegraph emerged, until particularly the US courts decided to set them up as what we call common carriers, for which they bear no liability for third-party content. The same problem is emerging in very serious forms again in the age of the internet. When you hear the debate about online liability, and I think the biggest debate has happened in the US. Those who have followed the Craigslist set of cases and the Backpage.com cases and all the big fight with Congress over these issues, it tells you that these are very complicated matters that require deeper reflection. If we don't resolve that, what would happen is that either government can use national security considerations to order the signal distributor not to carry a particular type of content, or the signal distributors themselves may hide behind that in order not to carry content. Whatever it is, even in the best of situations, you are applying just common law tort principles. It will mean that in order to avoid liability, the signal distributors should have the power to reject content that they consider problematic, which then would make them censors. So we think that this is something that we need to think about. The reverse of it is also very critical. If we consider the signal distributor as just a common carrier like in telephones, what it would mean is that they would not be able to benefit from constitutional protections. Because protections for free expression accrue to media, not to infrastructure. So we think that these are things that we need to really think through as we move into migration. The next big issue that we think is of concern is how do you regulate the relationship between the content producers and the signal distributors? There are two main ways by which this can be done, either by contract or by statute, as in law. If we can go the contract route and say, listen, this is a business arrangement between two business entities, and therefore they should be able to resolve the relationship issues by contract. The challenge there is that if for any reason the signal distributor refuses to carry content from the content producer, then the content producer can only sue under contract. At law, broadly speaking, there are only about 5 ways by which one can secure remedy for breach of contract. Either for damages, which is essentially compensation, or what we call the 3 R's: rescission, restitution, reformation. Rescission is where the court decides that the other party didn't have the authority to enter into the contract, and therefore you can withdraw from the contract. Restitution happens where you have paid money towards the contract, but the other party is unable to perform, and therefore the court says whatever you have invested in, that party should refund to you. Reformation is a very, very rare thing where in situations where the court says the terms of this contract is unconscionable, and therefore the court itself is revising the terms. Because the principle of contract is that the court should respect agreements, the court ordinarily does not interfere with agreements. So if you look at all these, the only one left is specific performance, where the court would say, please carry out the terms of the contract as you have undertaken. Usually the court does that mainly in property issues, where the court says no two pieces of land are the same, simply by their location. Occasionally, they may do that for articles of rare value, but essentially, the court does not apply this ordinarily to contract. And even to property, it's a discretionary rule. So the point you are seeking to make here is that if you look at the 5 approaches to remedies, perhaps the only one that is possible is damages. We think that damages would not adequately compensate for political expression, for example. So if in an election, the signal distributor refuses content from a particular content producer, the implications for politics, for governance, and for democracy would be higher than any money that could be paid for that. So we think that we need to look at this. However, across the continent, almost all our countries are either completely silent about how this relationship should be organized or are adopting the approach of contract. And we think that this is something that we need to look at. The next, and perhaps our last point in terms of the issues that are of concern to us this afternoon, is how do you manage excess capacity on a multiplex or signal distribution? We've indicated that on one frequency, you can compress a number of channels. So let us say that you build a signal distributing platform that can carry 50 channels. But in a given country, there are only 10 television stations. So you push all that content in. But you still have excess capacity to carry 40 more channels. Should the owner and operator of this signal distributor have the power to carry his own content on this platform? This is particularly relevant for countries, in our view, that are operating with StarTimes. Because StarTimes is both a content producer and a signal distributor, a platform builder and manager. We think that this kind of arrangement can create conflict of interest. It can easily lead to market distortion, because if they decide to rent to their affiliates at a cheaper cost, or in the case of the Chinese companies, it can easily become a point for the distribution of Chinese propaganda. And we want to use a quick case from Ghana to illustrate this, where the GIBA is the Ghana Independent Broadcasters Association. Under the arrangement in Ghana, GIBA is alleging that the government has given StarTimes the opportunity to create 100 additional channels for themselves. And it involved the government in some major controversy that we may not go into. So, what do we do if we agree that these are matters of concern? We have 2 broad recommendations. One is about mobilization, and we'll come to the other very quickly. We think that these matters can affect the information space in Africa, and therefore we need to build and engage a broad coalition of citizens and civil society to address the issue. But because it looks like technology to civil society, all through our countries, civil society is retrenching themselves from engagement and debate. We think we need to support them with capacity. We need to educate them to be able to understand that there are major governance issues here that they need to show interest in. We also believe that further research into these issues are needed, and that the questions about the policy implications of the ownership, control, and management of communications infrastructure in Africa need to be looked into, and more research should be done into this. We are also suggesting a partnership between international funding agencies and think tanks to engage more deliberately and sincerely in communications regulatory policies and systems across Africa. And finally, in terms of the mobilization strategy, also want to suggest that African Parliament, as the representatives of the people, need to show a little more interest in what is going on. So if we're able to build this coalition, what should they be doing? We think that the coalition should work towards pushing for legislation that is transparent and democratic to guide this process. In particular, it is our suggestion that any piece of legislation that is developed should set out the allocation of liability between broadcast signal distributors and content producers. We think that we need to determine the legal status of the BSDs in order to be able to clear our minds whether they bear liability for the work they do or any offensive content. We also call for the establishment of an independent body to manage the signal distribution platforms, with the hope that this body that we are calling for will have the capacity to evaluate decisions on the long-term implications for free expression, rule of law, and democracy in Ghana. Ultimately, we believe that the digital migration process will have tremendous impact on the African information space, and it is therefore very important that we create a policy framework that ensures the process is a boon and not a threat to democracy on the continent. Thank you very much.
Well, George, that was a tour de force, if I may say so. Extraordinary clarity on very complex issues I think even I could understand, which I'm very grateful. That explains really what is at stake here. And you have provided a plan of action. So congratulations on an excellent presentation. We will now turn the floor to Nick, who will give some comments for the group. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sally. Thanks so much, George. We've, at SEMA, just enjoyed engaging with you so much over the last few weeks, and we're going to be very sorry to see you go, but as you say, the party hopefully is not over, and I'm sure we'll continue to find ways to work together. And in fact, my comments today are going to be focused on how we can continue to work together, not just SEMA, but we in terms of the broader community of organizations around the world working on freedom of expression and media independence. I'd like to start with a quote that I use probably a bit too much by Emily Bell, writing from Columbia University, writing last year in The Guardian. She says, how we arbitrate the rights and responsibilities of maintaining a free and fair press function is one of the defining political issues of our age, and we seem to be inadequately prepared for the task. Now, I know Emily Bell did not have the digital migration in mind when she wrote that, but it is another example of an issue on which we seem to be woefully prepared. And an issue on which there are, which seems to be perhaps technical to some, maybe commercial at best, but that actually has profound implications, as you pointed out so clearly, for censorship and for pluralism in the media. And the way I have kind of come to understand the challenge that you face, George, on this issue in Ghana and other regulators and allies elsewhere, is that we need to find a way to pull this issue out from the obscurity of technical and commercial debates that tend to surround it and into the light of a broader debate about pluralism, about the kind of media that we need to sustain democratic politics. And at the Center for International Media Assistance, we see that there is a tremendous amount of interest around the world in having that broad debate. And we really need the kind of translators and interpreters who can bring those technical issues to a broader community. So we're just so pleased that you would be a diplomatic force of that kind to a broader community. Maybe it's George's optimistic nature that's rubbing off on me, but I will say that in our discussions about this issue, it has actually reassured me that it is possible for us to make progress on this kind of an issue, and I think you've laid out some really excellent recommendations for how to do that. I'd just like to reflect, let's say from my institutional standpoint, about how we can help you achieve those recommendations and bullet points that you laid out at the end of your presentation. So I have 3 or 4 items to highlight about how SEMA, in conjunction with allies, many of the people in this room, in fact, how we can work together to help George to govern the digital migration in Ghana in a way that favors pluralism and democratic governance and a healthier public sphere. The first, and I hope this will be a point of conversation, and George, I'm sure, will have further responses to my response, but the first is, we can help to set whatever you want to call it, standards, guidelines, or best practices, enshrined by organizations like the Organization of America, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, by the African Union, or other regional blocs like ECOWAS. And these standards and guidelines should really take into consideration the precise points that you're making. Put digital migration in a broader frame of democratic norms, of protections against censorship and the values of pluralism, and allow to empower someone like you to hold that document up when you're facing skeptics and say, even the OECD recommends that this should be a statutory, that this is a statutory issue, that we need to have an independent body, and that these are the protections that we need against censorship with these kinds of arrangements. Linked to that, and this is something that we've talked about before, George, is I think collectively we can work to create better diagnostic processes downstream in the public policy process that allow regulators to evaluate the impact of their decisions and their policy process and the processes that they put in place for regulation, not just on issues of efficiency and how much they've made off the spectrum sale, but off fundamental issues of the impact of those decisions on pluralism, on the quality of news and information that people are receiving. And there's just not enough of that, but we could work together to create that, I think. Secondly, George, you're definitely one of a kind, but you're not alone out there. We've realized there are other really forward-thinking and progressive-minded regulators that we've been fortunate enough to come to know over the years at SEMA. Pansy Tlakula in South Africa is one of them. The forum's own Marera Godina is now on the board of the Ethiopian Broadcasting Commission.
Former fellow.
Yeah, former, indeed. And I think we could do a lot of good by bringing together these kinds of regulators to compare notes, peer-to-peer learning, but also as a force for perhaps cajoling and coaxing some of the less forward-thinking regulators. And we've seen this kind of approach work before. In Latin America, SEMA, UNESCO, the Organization of American States, there's a number of organizations have helped there to promote, and with support from NED as well, a growing network of judges that are building momentum for protection of freedom of expression, for implementing the great frameworks that Latin America already has, spreading their knowledge, awareness of those issues, and again, kind of cajoling those that might be a little skeptical or unwilling to really enforce the laws as they're meant to be. So that kind of a model, I think, could be applied to this challenge. Thirdly, George has indicated that even in his privileged perch as executive secretary of the National Media Commission, he needs allies in civil society and in think tanks to help him to make the case, to create the political opportunity for you to maneuver in. And what, I don't mean to steal your thunder, but I know that you have approached behind the scenes the Media Foundation for West Africa, Suleiman Abrama, a partner of ours at SEMA, a great ally, a great organization, and an organization with the capacity to do the kinds of things you need. But one of the challenges that Media Foundation for West Africa and many other great organizations like that are facing is that there has been a gradual move towards project-focused funding out there that just does not give them the discretion to work opportunistically, to take up new issues. It's unfortunately a field that's become so donor-driven that it's hard for someone like Suleiman, even if he's convinced that this is a big issue, to work on it. Secondly, think tanks. We at SEMA would love to see more policy-oriented, influential Southern think tanks taking on media issues. The funding for that kind of work is not always forthcoming. That's one of the things that we work on at SEMA and we will continue to work on. And I think one of the things that we can do going forward as we advocate for funders to put more money into think tanks to address this issue is to add digital migration to the list of, to the long list of issues that they should also be looking at. So, and then there's one last point I'll add that you didn't, that is from a very different institutional standpoint, and to end on a bit of a high note. In Kenya, as you point out, the digital migration did enable the government to shut down broadcasting last year in January. And in fact, part of that was vis-a-vis the Ministry of Information, Communication, and Telecommunications sending a letter to Star Times asking them to turn off the transmission. And they did so, I think, I'm told, without questioning. But the other thing that's happened in Kenya that does shed a positive light on the potential for this is that there is a whole new generation of news and information providers that have gotten access through the digital transmission system there that could potentially challenge the big three media providers that have had a stranglehold on the media space in Kenya for so long themselves. What can we do to help those small upstarts, often in local languages, to provide more quality, professional, engaging information and news, and to strengthen pluralism? I'll end with another quote that I also use far too frequently by Natalie Fenton, professor at Goldsmiths University. When she was reflecting on what she views as the disappointment in new communication, the aspirations of new communication technologies, the promise of new communication technologies to challenge entrenched power interests and to democratize the communication space, she has this to say: newness of form and content is quickly smothered by predominance, size, and wealth, but history does not always repeat itself. And I think with allies like George, collectively we have an opportunity, if we work hard enough and intelligently enough, to ensure that history does not repeat itself this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for that very eloquent overview of the work that SEMA does and the concerns and how you can work with George. And I think it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship, if I may quote the movie Casablanca.
On Valentine's Day.
George, given all that Nick has put forward, would you like to say a few words at this time on some of the issues that he raised, or shall we take some questions from the audience?
They are clear enough not to be distorted by my commentary.
Very good. So we now have time for Q&A. If you could identify yourself, there is a microphone that will come your way, and we are open for questions. This lady right here, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Hi, I'm Christine Landau-Juggler, a program officer for West Africa at IRI. Thank you so much. This was so interesting. I just wanted to ask if you think that this specific issue that you discussed differs in different regions of Africa, and if there are different approaches that you think are appropriate for each region.
That's a nice big question, so
Yeah.
would you like to comment, George?
Unfortunately, there isn't much diversity in the approaches. The only thing that we have observed is that in some of the countries, instead of one simple platform for everybody, the government have decided to build two. One for the government broadcaster and the other for all commercial operators, which then does not obviate the danger that we are concerned with. So we are not seeing too much diversity in terms of approach. But this is partly due to a very simple fact. The decision to migrate was a decision at the level of ITU. At the time the decision was taken, capacity around the continent was extremely limited. And migration itself had come about as a result of what turned out to be some interesting fight between the US and the Japan technology companies, where the US worked very fast and took over the process. So capacity was very limited, starting from the US to the UK and a bit of Europe. But because the technology that the Japanese were promoting had been cut short, they themselves at some point almost had to relearn. So it's taken a bit of time for capacity on these issues to get diffused. And so on the continent, everybody just went for that one solution that they thought was available, starting from, I think, South Africa and Kenya. And then Ghana followed suit, and the rest of West Africa tagged on to Ghana. So that is the situation.
Other questions or comments? Yes, in the back there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Juliet. I'm from Kenya. I'm a fellow at Amnesty International. The question of digital migration, I feel that citizens were not prepared for it, especially in Kenya. It was just introduced and forced upon the citizens because people rejected it and the media houses were shut down. And taking into consideration these other service providers, Signet, DSTV, and people have to pay subscription every month for watching all these programs. And taking into consideration the socioeconomic status of people in Kenya or in Africa, and most are in rural areas, we have women who do not have money to pay subscription every month. How do you balance the socioeconomic status of people, of poor people in Africa, and access to information through digital migration?
Thank you very much.
I don't think I have an answer. Let me confess. But it is also very interesting that you say in Kenya the citizens were not prepared. It heightens the concern because for every regulator in Africa, the best case scenario that is cited is Kenya. But your point is the truth. In other words, it is the best of a terribly worse situation. So if you take the case of Kenya, every regulator in Africa would say, well, the Kenyans spent so much time and so much money to get everybody involved. In fact, as part of the process, there were a series of challenges to the process that went to the Supreme Court. And as a result of that, a little more information on that came out. But sincerely, I completely agree with you that even we as regulators, it just came and we are still learning. And so we cannot pretend that we got the citizens with us, except that, again, few regulators will agree that in Kenya the people were not as involved as we see. But the truth is that the people were not. I completely agree with you.
Hi, Juliet, yeah? You raise an excellent point. And just to add to what George is saying, I was in Kenya at the time that the digital migration was being negotiated. I wasn't involved in any particular way, though I was working with some journalists there at the time. And what I observed then and what I've heard since is that the way that it was debated, it was really led by the media owners who were concerned, first and foremost, if not primarily, solely, about losing the advantages that they have accumulated by investing in analog infrastructure. So, they just wanted an assurance that the barriers to entry would remain high enough to protect their investments over the years. At the same time, the Editors Guild did try to raise some concerns about censorship, and there ended up being some small concessions made to allow a couple of the outlets there to transmit on their own digitally. So it's not just one stranglehold, to be fair, in Kenya, but there's just a few now. But a small concession was made in that regard, but you're absolutely right that the citizens were also, I remember very clearly, upset about the need to go out and buy oftentimes a really expensive box to suddenly get free-to-air TV or subscribe to DSTV. And I think what the lesson learned there is that there was an opportunity to galvanize public around that issue of cost and access to news and information that was lost because there wasn't really at the time an interlocutor who could channel those grievances into a broader public conversation about where are we going with this digital migration and how is it going to benefit Kenyans. I think that was a missed opportunity, but I think you raise a really good point about the entry point to getting citizens involved in these kinds of issues.
Just a small addition to what Nick said. For those who are not too familiar with Kenya, it's important to point out that in Africa, we think Kenya has one of the best media systems and infrastructure across the continent. So when you hear comments like this about Kenya, it should tell you the difficulties with the rest of the continent. The second thing is that Nick is so right about those concessions. The challenge with the concessions they made was that the spectrum that was given to those ones were given under very unclear terms. So they have no protection for the security of the spectrum, which means that any day Kenya could easily slide into the dangers that we are concerned with.
Yes, in the back row, from Ned.
Thank you. My name's Ross Conroy. I'm with Ned with the Africa team. So my question is a little bit about how these experiences with censorship or regulation might change when we're looking at internet. So we've seen in DRC, in Zimbabwe, blanket internet cuts. In Chad, there's been social media that's been blocked for over 300 days now, I believe. So how does these questions of regulation and censorship change when we're looking at broadcasting versus digital freedom on the internet?
This is another big question that you should have sent to Nick. Not me. But I think that you again raise a very fundamental question that we cannot pretend to have an answer immediately. Except that if we addressed the questions of intermediary liability with clarity, we may find a way out in the democracies. And again, we can only limit it to the democracies. In the US, as a response to some of these critical questions, the US passed a law, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230 of which decided to create safe harbors for intermediaries. Okay, so if you were an internet company or a hosting site, you may not necessarily bear liability for offensive content from third parties. for copyright, I think that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in Section 512 did a similar thing in the US. So in the democracies where you have effective courts, if you had similar such legislation, then you could very easily run to the Supreme Court on grounds of free expression to stop the state from interfering with internet rights. In those ones where there are no effective courts, it's really difficult to tell how this will be done. But again, that is one of the reasons why the China angle is so interesting. Amongst regulators in Africa, there is something that is said hush, hush. American and European companies operating in Africa, everybody agrees go through 3 models of behavior when it comes to internet suspension. First, they will protest. Second, if the government doesn't budge, they may negotiate to say, what is your problem, and can we find alternative approaches to dealing with the problem rather than shutting down the internet? The third level is where the pressure is too high and they comply. The Chinese companies readily, as soon as, you don't need to discuss, as soon as the letter from the minister hits, the internet is off. The only thing they are demanding then from the regulator will be say, how do we make up our cost? We were going to make this amount of money within this period. Is the state ready to reduce our regulatory fees for the period to make up for the loss? And in most cases, because the state is more interested in the politics, they will grant that. So that is another element that the ownership issues also become particularly useful. But to come back to the point, I do not think that there are any easy answers to the question you raised. But I also want to hear your thought on that.
Nick.
So I think, well, Daniel O'Malley, our digital policy expert at Center for International Media Assistance, is a good person to talk to about these issues afterwards if you want to grab him. I think I'll say broadly that protecting against internet shutdowns, is a slightly different issue from some of the more nuanced aspects of regulating social media and telecommunications. And I think there seems to be a pretty, at least among the media freedom community and the internet rights community, really, shared and strong commitment to using every lever necessary to stop those kinds of things from happening, whether it be the courts or getting, regional blocks like ECOWAS in the case of Ghana to intervene, making sure that standards and norms are accepted wherever possible, enforced, and, looking for all the levers possible to stop that. Where I think our community is a little more torn is when it comes to the more subtle issues of how to regulate a social media, or digital advertising market. And there's, still within our community many folks who feel like, given the history of abuses of that space, that it's best not to engage the regulatory side at all, and those who feel like, well, if we don't engage regulators in ensuring that digital advertising markets favor independent media, then someone else is going to determine probably that they're not going to favor independent media. So there, I think it gets a bit trickier, and there's no easy answer.
Thank you. Other questions? Carrillo.
Thank you very much, George, for your presentation. It bears some parallels to my home country, where we have some advancement of our ways to pass content to the audience. I mean, the digital migration. We also have similar problems. My question is there is a chance to provide multiple platforms which can compete among them, and could be this as a solution to distribution of content and to delivery of more various content to the audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrillo. George?
Ordinarily, that should be possible, except that in the case of Africa, I don't see that happening for economic reasons. As we explained, governments need the spectrum, and each signal distributor that you license would need spectrum, so that takes away from the dividend that government is going to get. And it is not only for government. We still need the spectrum also to improve services in many other areas. So there's justification why the dividend is useful. At the same time, the cost of constructing the platforms is very high. So if each one of them is not going to get enough business, then there is no business case for that. So if you are not very careful, you'll invest in, let's say, 2 or 3 platforms, each one of them with excess capacity. And then you don't know what to do with it. What may then happen is that channel fees will have to be extremely high for the signal distributor to recover their cost, which then may be very prohibitive for TV stations and content producers. So it's slightly complicated in terms of the economics of it. But technically speaking, that should be possible.
Chris Walker at NED.
So, George, it was a fantastic presentation. I think you really laid out the issues very clearly. Nick, you alluded in the Kenya case to the lack of interlocutors who could help, in the best case, to explain to society choices they have, the decisions they have to make. Given the stakes, given the resources, given the inevitability of how this will play out across media systems there, in your recommendations you said need more of these interlocutors. Why aren't they there already? And what will it take to get a sufficient number of them in place to make a real difference?
If you want to start.
It's a good question, and why aren't they there already? I mean, I think if I think about the Kenya scene, I think is illustrative in some ways, and what you will find there is, Article 19 is on the ground, and they are excellent at understanding what's going on with the media bill and the cybersecurity law, and are pretty good at translating those for a broader audience. I think Article 19, though, sometimes can be not as well connected to the kinds of civil society organizations that have access on the ground to citizens in rural areas. And, I mean, this has been a trend in Kenya as elsewhere where, over time, you've ended up with an elite, capital-centric civil society with technical expertise and a less elite but well-connected civil society in rural areas. And I think, as where those two, I don't know that one interlocutor can do it, to be honest. I think it's a matter of, and this is where we at SEMA have oftentimes, called for multi-stakeholder coalitions, trying to find a way to bring together those different pieces of the puzzle around some shared understanding of the problem so that they can work collectively together. But the trajectory that's led to this division, I think, is partly an effect of donor-driven funding that has, I think, pushed some civil society organizations off the real target of what citizens want, unfortunately, at times. And I'm not accusing Article 19 of that. They're fabulous. But
Article 19 is an international NGO? Or
it's a network. So they have Article 19 East Africa is based in Nairobi, and I think has funding independently of Article 19 West Africa. I could be mischaracterizing their organization. Sorry, Chris, if that's not maybe a great answer, but
it's a start.
Oh, sorry.
George.
The other thing I see, maybe two things. One is the capacity issue for civil society we just talked about. And two is that, at least in West Africa, regulators completely stonewall civil society. They do not see civil society as understanding the issues. If you're a regulator and you're dealing with operators who have invested heavily, telecom companies and stuff like that, it is very difficult to, in consultation processes, mix the interest of these big money players, and in regulatory field, I've never even heard any reference to civil society. They derisively describe them as NGOs. These are people who are collecting funds and just making noise. They don't have anything at stake here, and they just want to come and delay you. So in consultation processes, nobody involves them. If you allowed me just a quick anecdote, because I come from civil society background, I fought very hard on the board of the National Communications Authority when we were giving out licenses. And I said, we've got to consult. The chairman then looked me straight in the eye and said, George, have you heard of the English breakfast called egg and bacon? I said, what of it? He said, okay. You see, the pig and the hen both make contributions to the breakfast, but not at the same level. The hen comes to lay the egg and it goes away. As for the pig, it has to die. So even though both of them are making contributions, one is involved, the other is engaged. So when we are talking about regulatory issues here, look at those NGOs as the hens in the process, look at the operators as the pigs. We can't mix their interests.
Wow.
I lost the debate. Okay, so...
George, I think you should find a different way to eat breakfast. That's the thing. There are other breakfast foods.
The point I'm seeking to make, and Nick has said it in various ways, we need to bring civil society into the conversation. We need to find them a table at the regulatory discussions. As we speak, I always tell my colleagues in Ghana that on regulatory issues, there are 6 circles of influence. In the inner core, the first 2 circles are government and regulators, depending on the country, it's either the regulator in the middle or the government in the middle, but the first 2 would be them. The second circle is the media owners. The third circle, interestingly, are international donors. The next circle are media professional associations. The last circle will be civil society and others, in terms of who can exert influence on the regulatory processes. So groups like CIMA stand a better chance of even working to bring African civil society closer, because if you entered the field, your credibility, your image as international organizations will secure you a seat faster than civil society in these countries. So somebody would need to hold the hand of civil society, give them the capacity, and still bring them in. Otherwise, it is going to take a long time to get this done. We talked about Media Foundation for West Africa, which is one of the best media rights institutions in West Africa. I can say proudly that I was the very first programs officer Professor Karakari recruited to start the organization. So that is where I trained on all these issues of free expression. If you ask Sule, they will tell you they have almost zero influence on regulatory policy. There's not a single policy regulators are taking that they have consulted the Media Foundation or any of the agencies or even listened to them. And it's heart-wrenching. we need to think through this very, very critically and say, there is no way we can democratize these processes by keeping civil society out. And therefore, we need to think through how to bring them in as a first strategic move. Thank you.
Very good. Very well said. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes, Vera.
Hello, I'm Vera Gogochia. I'm a Reagan Fassel Fellow from Georgia.
And the owner of the party.
Surely. George, I have a question. I'm very, for people who are so unaware about these issues, would be when you showed this wonderful map with lots of red stars, which represented Chinese companies who are the distribution companies, right? I understood correctly, right? So is there a need for making it transparent how these Chinese companies are bidding? Is it not the government who is announcing the bidding? And how it happened that every time the Chinese companies get it? And if you think there are some questions about that, because there must be some questions about that, this is an issue which civil society might be interested and hooked, because that's a matter of transparency, clarity, and in whose hands, very simply saying, whose hands this regulation gets into. And this is when people could be alarmed and alert, I wonder. And then the more complicated issues that you're talking about could be more broadly discussed, because you can't just invite civil society into it. I think civil society should be breaking into that table and demanding to be there. And maybe something should be raised, put a question to public, to civil society, and
to give them a cause to rally around.
Yeah,
Thank you, Vera.
Thank you.
George, comment?
Maybe I cannot tell about the procurement processes in the different countries and how StarTimes came to be the provider. But I can quickly tell you a small story about the Ghana situation. In Ghana, the government contracted StarTimes mainly because government needed money, and StarTimes said, we can get the money from the Chinese Exim Bank to build a platform. This was under the previous administration. So they gave them the contract. Then the government said they had failed to deliver on the contract, so government terminated the contract. That administration lost elections. When government terminated the contract, the Chinese company sued the government of Ghana at the High Court in Ghana and lost the case. Then they took the matter to international arbitration. Whilst the matter was at international arbitration, there was a new administration after elections. Then, somehow, the Ghanaian company that had been contracted to build the platform, stakeholders say had almost completed the project. But somehow when the new administration came, the contract was given back to the Chinese. The former Minister for Communications, under whom the contract was terminated, publicly issued a statement alleging that the contract was given back to the Chinese company after the president and his wife visited China and visited the headquarters of the Chinese company, and claimed that the Chinese company had made a donation to the First Lady's Foundation. The First Lady's office explained that they did not make a donation to the foundation. They made a donation through the foundation to some other children's NGOs that needed support very badly, and that the First Lady had no hand in the award of the contract. Interestingly, this is just about last year. In 2015, a newspaper that was very, very close to the president at the time, called the Al-Hajj, had carried a story that has said that when the government abrogated the contract, the Chinese government got upset and refused to release loans they had promised Ghana. And that they believed the Chinese government was seeking to manipulate the Ghanaian government to re-award the contract to StarTimes. So when the new administration re-awarded the contract to StarTimes, then public mind came back to this issue. What could have been the justification for which the new administration would take over the contract from the Ghanaian company that had almost completed the infrastructure and hand it back to the Chinese? As I have said, I don't know how the processes went in any of those countries, but this is what I recall from the Ghanaian situation. And it appears to me that you understand.
One quick follow-up question. The whole story you've recounted over the StarTimes contract, was that covered in the press, or do you have that knowledge only through back channels?
Heavily covered in the media. Every bit of it, including the former minister actually published his letter online. You will still find it. I think I checked a couple of days. It was still on My Joy Online. It's on City Online, City FM Online. His name is Omane Boama, and he had made, and the First Lady's Foundation's response, fortunately, is also online. So anybody can access the information and the whole debate around the contracting issues. The court case was adequately reported in the media. You will find information on that, as well as the London arbitration issues.
I would just add to what George is saying in answer to your question, and it speaks a little bit to Chris's earlier question, that I think some of these issues sometimes fall a little bit in a kind of civil society no man's land, where the media freedom and freedom of expression advocates tend to stick to the media laws and defamation laws and trying to get journalists out of prison. And then you have a whole set of other civil society actors that are really focused, as you say, on procurement and accountability and transparency, but don't tend to apply those tools to what's going on within the media sector itself. And so, these kinds of things pass in the no man's land between those two communities. And we know, at SEMA, we've tried to kind of bring together those communities to think about how they can learn from one another or work together, as the case may be. But that's part of the problem.
I think, Chris, we also need to add to it a certain reality that is problematic. Civil society in Africa, and particularly in West Africa, tend to be, and I include myself because I belong there, overly reactive. So the matter happens, we see the impact, and then that is the point at which, because there's something concrete to relate to, we mobilize to its protest. Our capacity to do prognosis into the environment is weak. Even sometimes when we are able to do it, because it's not happened and looks abstract, it becomes very difficult to mobilize society around it. It looks to me as if we are able to respond when the issues are there more concretely, and that makes us always play behind time. And I think it is one of the things that perhaps, as we think through what we need to do, we need to reflect on in terms of the approaches that we adopt in civil society towards some of these issues.
We have time for one more question. There is. Any last question? If not, we are really at the end of our time. I'd like to say this happens to be my last event at NED, since I'll be stepping down at the end of the month after 18 years. And I have to say it has been one of the most pleasant and interesting events that I've had the privilege to chair. I've learned a lot, and I want to say to George, you are an activist, a diplomat, and an educator, all rolled into one. And I think your agenda is going to require all of your skills as you seek to raise awareness and mobilize a concerted effort in response to these challenges. Nick, thank you for your excellent contribution as well. A round of applause.
I didn't realize this was your last event, Sally, and I know Ned has found many ways to thank you for your tremendous contribution. I'm a newbie here, and I mean, you are, you're the heart and soul of Ned in many ways, but maybe the crowd should also give a round of applause to Sally for everything.